is up, guys? Frosty 0232 here today for another Frosty Features. What we have today is our second Illuminati member that is coming to the game. Lock up your wives, it's Hank Pym. So what this is a comic book background on the tunes that you use in Marvel Strike Force, and I am your guide through the pages. So, starting off, we're going to read the blog post description. That is the description of who the character is according to Marvel Strike Force, and we will rate it at the end of the feature. Dr. Hank Pym is a brilliant scientist who discovered a unique set of subatomic particles, which he named Pym particles, allowing him to alter his size and mass. Using this breakthrough, he became the superhero Ant-Man, founding member of the Avengers, and later assumed other heroic identities such as Giant Man, Goliath, and Yellow Jacket. Despite his heroic contributions, Pym's career has been marked by personal struggles, including his creation of the dangerous artificial intelligence, Ultron, which has repeatedly threatened humanity. We will rate this at the end of the feature. This is the man of the hour. This is Hank Pym. Name, Dr. Henry Hank Pym. He is an entomologist. Right? First appearance, Tales to Astonish number 27, 1961. There is a retcon where he was in a different Tales to Astonish retroactively. Like, canon corrected it and said, actually, this was him in 1960, but his actual first appearance as Hank Pym, 1961. And I think Tales to Astonish number 35 is when we first see Ant-Man. Let me know in the comments if that's right. I don't remember. That's just off the top of my head. Powers and abilities. Zoom in, zoom out. His gigantification, and he also gets smaller. Minification? Shrinking and growing. Yeah. And extra-dimensional travel. He can shrink so small that he can hop into different dimensions. Going into the microverse, which in the comics is microverse. In the movies, in the MCU, it's the quantum verse. So there's these things. Aliases: Ant-Man, Giant Man, Yellow Jacket, Wasp, and Goliath. He goes by all of these interchangeably quite a bit. Very notably is the Yellow Jacket persona. We see it in the What If Marvel Zombie, the What If Marvel series. We also see it quite a bit in the comics. There's quite a long run where he goes as Yellow Jacket. For a very long stint, he goes as just Giant Man. He also fights Yellow Jacket, the Wasp, and Goliath on multiple occasions. So it's just sort of a big thing, but it's a big convoluted mess. But ultimately, all of these different aliases have essentially the same power sets. He just focuses on using different power sets at the time, right? So, specifically with Wasp and Yellow Jacket, he's also using stingers, which is like a projected blast. So, very, very important. Affiliations: Avengers, Illuminati, and Secret Defenders. Hank Pym's been around since 1961. He's been heavily affiliated with a whole bunch of different teams. So, in this specific situation, I just brought up the ones that are pertinent to MSF. So unlike Black Panther Shuri, we actually have a member of the Illuminati who's in the Illuminati, which is super exciting. Background: East Nowhere, Nebraska. Fictional place as far as I can tell. In Nebraska, he was born and raised, identified as a genius at a young age, and was groomed to go to college, etc., right? So, who died? Can't be superhero, supervillain without somebody dying. And in Hank Pym's situation, he had two people that died that made him into who he was. So, as he was identified at a young age as a genius, his grandmother is the person that really pushes his curiosity and inspires him to invent things. So he invents things at a very young age. And we'll talk about that a little bit more because we're going to go over his origin and the notable events. So his grandmother really pushes him to build these events, things like that, and eventually she passes due to, I think it's an unnamed illness. I couldn't actually find, I knew she died, but I couldn't figure out what it was from. But she passes from some sort of illness, and this sends him on the beginning of his spiraling. And then his wife Maria dies, which leads him to actually pursue becoming a superhero or Ant-Man. Once again, we will talk about this a little bit more in depth as we move forward. Very important thing to note about Hank Pym. Hank Pym is Tony Stark, who struggles with mental illness. Tony Stark is a genius philanthropist, billionaire playboy that struggles with alcoholism in the comics. And does so very little in the MCU. Hank Pym is essentially the same character who struggles with mental illness. So the first time we see this in the comics is in his origin story. I believe, as I said before, Tales of Astonish 35. We start getting his origin story right around there, so still in 1961. We start getting his origin story, and we're seeing that once his grandmother passes, we see him go into his first huge depressive slump. And as the comic book arcs expand and time goes on, we see really the lows that he can go to. In fact, he also has comic diagnosed schizophrenia. So I don't know how many psychologists were there to write that, but in canon they'll bring up his struggle with schizophrenia. So this is something very important to consider as far as his character is concerned, especially with some of the stuff we're going to talk about in the notable events. So very important thing to be aware of. Fear of death and successors. Another thing that Hank Pym has that is kind of a big deal is he fears death quite a bit, and he does not want his mantle to go unheld one way or the other, which is probably a good explanation as to why he has multiple aliases. But this is actually how he goes about getting Scott Lang to replace him as Ant-Man, is because of his fear of leaving it behind. So we've talked about legacy heroes a few times on Frosty Features. Check out Frosty Features Black Knight, who's a very notable legacy hero. A legacy hero essentially is a mantle that gets passed on, picked up, etc. So Hank Pym is the beginning of a legacy that he wants to have, even though at this current state, as of this recording date, there's only, I believe, 3 Ant-Men. There's only 3 Ant-Men that have been around, right? Also, another big thing to point out in Marvel Strike Force, I find very interesting. Another big thing to point out is that the version of Hank Pym that we are getting in Marvel Strike Force is Giant Man. That's why I used him here, because that very specifically is the Giant Man costume, and we're getting him as Giant Man, but they went ahead and called him Hank Pym, which is an interesting choice. So yeah. And relationships. So Hank Pym has many notable relationships. We just spoke about his grandmother, Angela Pym, who kind of pushed a lot for his creativity and for him to push his imagination as far as inventing things goes. Brad and Doris Pym are his parents. They're well-meaning. Maria Trovaya, which I probably just said wrong, is his ex-wife by decease. He is a widower. Janet Van Dyne is his ex-wife by divorce. She's probably the most notable of his relationships, as Janet Van Dyne is the Wasp to his Ant-Man, right? Nadia Van Dyne and William Nelson are his children, his biological children. He didn't raise William Nelson, but Nadia Van Dyne eventually becomes the Wasp. This essentially is the MCU equivalent to Hope Van Dyne. This is the 616 equivalent to Hope Van Dyne in Earth 199999. The MCU. Because she doesn't exist in that form in the Marvel 616. And then also a very important thing to keep in mind is so we talked about this in many other Frosty Features where they develop these notable children that are children, or robots or something like that, some sort of creation that sort of works as a child. In this situation, most notably, he makes a lot of robots that exist in the Marvel multiverse. Ultron is his creation, and that's one thing I find really interesting about this blog post. We'll talk about it in a bit. I tried to go back and see what the description of Ultron was for Marvel Strike Force, because once again, I've been bringing it up a lot lately in the recent conversations about content creators and how they perceive lore for Marvel Strike Force. I wasn't around for the release of Ultron. I assumed this whole time the model of Ultron in game is based off of Avengers Age of Ultron, the MCU version. So I assumed that in Marvel Strike Force canon, Ultron was created by Tony Stark like he was in the MCU, but in Hank Pym's blog post description, it says that he was created by Hank Pym, which is comic accurate. So I can't prove it on the Ultron end. Let me know in the comments whether or not Ultron's original release said that he was a Hank Pym or Tony Stark creation, or both, because also I believe there's a universe where both are technically true. Anyway, moving forward, notable events. Becoming Ant-Man. We gotta talk about the origin. So, in Becoming Ant-Man, we have Hank Pym, a 3-year-old that shows the aspects and aspirations of being a super genius, and his parents have him tested, and he is, and they don't really know what to do with it. So his grandmother shows up and encourages him to tinker and encourages him to build things, and by the time he's 5, he creates a typewriter that can type in 50... He's also on a sliding time scale because he's been around for so long and Marvel's been around for so long. So typewriters were a thing, and it could type in 15 different colors, and that was a big deal. He also developed a little box you could put on a car to change the sound of the horn to anything you want, which is something we totally have now, which is pretty cool. All from years before. And there's this whole thing where his dad is like, yeah, you're really good, son, and I really want to be able to help you grow as an inventor, and you just made this cool horn thing that changes stuff on the car. What if you built a carburetor? And essentially his mom's like, well, anybody can build a carburetor, Brad. And he's like, oh gosh, I'm so sorry for saying something that was so dumb. And ultimately his grandmother gets sick because life and people happen, right? Even in the comic books, sometimes this happens. So his grandmother gets sick, and he goes out to create a device that will cure her illness. And as far as comic canon goes, this would work. He creates a device to cure her illness, and she's like, no, I'm fine with it. I'm gonna die, Hank. Or Henry. I'm gonna die. It's okay. And refuses to use it. She passes, and he breaks down. And then, this is the kind of stuff that I really find is like, I'm gonna call it masterful writing, but she dies, so the first thing he does is breaks down and he builds a carburetor. And the next few years of his life is this sort of depressive, it's sort of this like depressive slump where he can't build anything of note, he can't discover anything of note because he's not trying to imagine anything. So he has to find his imagination. Eventually going to college and meeting his soon-to-be wife Maria, who was a Hungarian immigrant. So when they go to get married, they fall in love. They go to get married, and they're like, oh, ultimately Maria convinces him to go to Hungary for their honeymoon, and that's gonna be super great. And they go, and then these Hungarian terrorists kind of show up, and they just shoot her dead. They kill her for leaving. It's a whole political thing, because I mean Hank's not achieving Avengers level things at this point, but he's still a prominent scientist and he's doing very well for himself. But so they kill Maria in front of him, and he wants to do something about it, which leads him to one of his big pieces of research that he was doing. He's pitching the idea of being able to shrink things down to a specific size to a humanitarian board, but because of his depressive natures, he swings towards using it for military reasons, which a humanitarian board will never be interested in that, and they kind of laugh him out of the room. Granted, I do find that kind of an odd reaction due to the fact that very much, the idea of being able to shrink down and resize food in large quantities should be appealing to a humanitarian board, but I don't know. Anyway, with that, after Maria's death, he actually, he hyper focuses on his work, and this is how he discovers the Pym particles in looking at an ant farm he keeps in his lab. And with this, he discovers the Pym particles, and he starts shrinking things. This is when he's pitching things to humanitarians, and then they're like, nah. So he goes home, he's depressed, he's mad, so he tries to use it on himself, kind of just to see what would happen. And in this situation, he shrinks down, he's amazed, and then a mouse finds him and tries to eat him. So he's chased outside by this mouse, and he ends up getting stuck in a thing of honey outside, where he is rescued by an ant. And then at this point, he tries to go, he's rescued by an ant. There's some discrepancy on whether or not he had to fight some other ants to get out of the situation, because he is stronger, because the logic of the Ant-Man situation is when you get smaller, you become, all of your mass is sort of just pushed down, so you become that much stronger. So it's like compressed, sort of. With this situation, he goes back and he's trying to figure out a way to control the ants, and he develops his helmet, which allows him to speak to the ants and therefore control them, becoming effectively Ant-Man and becoming one of the he starts fighting crime, sort of in the memory of Maria, and he starts this is how he ends up becoming one of those founding members of Avengers, which is super cool. And eventually, throughout this process, he meets Janet, who is the daughter of one of his partners he was working with, who ends up becoming the Wasp, and also using, at first, the Pym particles are something that you expose to your skin and you could change. Then he ends up making a pill, and then he makes it a gas, and it's a whole thing. So Janet ends up using it quite a bit as well. Next, Trial of the Yellow Jacket. This is this is kind of the beginning of the end. Not really the beginning. This is kind of a point in his life where he's already on a steady decline. So the Trial of the Yellow Jacket is actually definitely, as far as like the character of Hank Pym, his low points, this is where he gets the lowest, right? So this is the way that this works is in creating Ultron to be a shield for the world, as Tony Stark puts it. He creates Ultron as a way to, at first, it's something to it's just sort of this deployable mass that can go out and protect people on, like, quickly, and effectively, and it betrays them and becomes Ultron that we know. One of the Avengers' biggest threats, biggest enemies, and after that happens and they're able to stop Ultron for the first time, Hank takes it very poorly. And this is where his schizophrenia truly manifests, and he ends up becoming he kind of like runs away and becomes a different persona of Yellow Jacket, who is much more brutal than Hank. Hank's a little bit more forgiving, and he sort of fights his way to Avengers Tower and asks to be added into the group, and a facial scan tells them that it's Hank, and all of them are like, yeah, this isn't good. He thinks he's Yellow Jacket. He does not think that he's Hank Pym. What are we gonna do? And they're like, okay, well, we're not gonna let Yellow Jacket into the Avengers to start off with. The Avengers are like, we're not gonna let him into the Avengers. Something's wrong here. We need to just leave him alone. And so he gets mad and he kidnaps Janet, and he's like, hey, Janet, we're gonna get married and you're gonna like it. You're gonna get married to the Yellow Jacket. And she's like, I still love you though. Like, you're having some issues and I respect that. I still love you. Let's get married. And so the Avengers help put on this wedding, and that is all nice and hunky-dory. And so there's a few things that happen in between where he kidnaps her, and it's weird, but he goes off gallivanting as the Yellow Jacket for a while, trying to make this wedding happen, and eventually they do let the Avengers get together and they make the wedding happen. And then the circus of crime actually invades the wedding. So when Janet goes to cut the cake at the wedding, a snake pops up and attacks. And at this point, we have Yellow Jacket kind of actually regaining his mental facilities, and we find him kind of for the first time come back as Hank Pym for a while, in this sort of like fighting back of the villains of taking out the villains in the wedding. We see him kind of come back to himself. So after this, we have Hank Pym operating as Ant-Man again, and we have Ant-Man and the Wasp. Things are hunky-dory. They are married now. They're enjoying that. It's going fine. And then eventually, we see Hank falling into a bit of a depressive streak because he can't... After his invention and use of the Pym particles, he isn't able to do anything that feels like it's worthwhile. He doesn't feel like he's building up to or discovering up to his own standards. So he starts to have a bit of a depressive streak. And there's a situation where the Avengers fight the Elf Queen, and they are able to whittle down her forces, what have you. And Captain America is sitting there negotiating things with her, sort of like, ceasefire negotiations, what have you. And Hank comes up behind her and shoots her in the back, which really, really ticks off Cap. So in retaliation, Cap's like, yeah, dude, you're banned from you're banned from this, and you're gonna be arrested. Like, you need help, and you need time to yourself. You're out of here. So with that, he court-martialed him, so he has to go to trial. And in this situation, his depression escalates significantly, and he takes back on the Yellow Jacket persona, and he's like, okay, well, if everybody wants to be crappy to me, I'm going to make a robot that only I know how to defeat, that I know will kill the Avengers, and I will save it I will save everybody when they beg me. And Janet shows up, and she's like, yo, that's a horrible idea. You shouldn't do that. And he turned around and he hits her. This is the hit heard around the world, right? So yes, he accidentally created Ultron, who is one of the worst and villains there is. But in this situation, he actively strikes his wife, mental illness. I'm not making excuses. He should never do this. One thing I want to point out about this that I find interesting. So here's Marvel publication history with Frosty. At this time, Jim Shooter was the head of Marvel. When we think of Stan Lee, Jim Shooter is in that position of Marvel at the time of this story arc going on. So supposedly, according to Jim Shooter, in this, as he wrote the comic, Hank was actually supposed to accidentally hit her, like a turnaround kind of thing, and hit her. But he claims that the artist drew it very brutally. And another thing that Jim Shooter is known for is forcibly hitting deadlines. So even though he wanted this redrawn, because they weren't going to be able to hit the deadline, they left this in, forever scarring the character of Hank Pym, which makes him gave him this wife beater persona. And this is sort of the main time that he does this, besides some of his straight up psychopathic runs he goes on much later. So back in it, he knocks Janet out, and he goes to the trial with his robot, but everything goes wrong, as did with Ultron, and the robot tries to kill Hank, and it's about to kill Hank, and Janet shows up and is able to disable and destroy the robot, as it were. He gets perma-banned from the Avengers. He gets divorced from Janet Van Dyne because obvious reasons, and then also he loses all of his monies, which is pretty sad. So he goes on a stunt of time where he is dealing with Egghead, who is a notable master of evil that is not in Marvel Strike Force. And ultimately Egghead more or less blackmails him into doing a bunch of stuff, and he can't prove it. So eventually we find that he becomes the Yellow Jacket for a long period of time. And after one said mission where the Yellow Jacket ends up going against the Avengers multiple times and is able to hold his own against most of the team. We also see that he goes up against the Masters of Evil quite a bit, also working with the Masters of Evil kind of on and off. I wouldn't say that he's a bona fide member, but he was kind of forced to work with him via Egghead. It was a situation where a mission kind of ends and Egghead's about to shoot Hank Pym in the head and just be done with him. And then Hawkeye at the same time shoots an arrow into Egghead's gun that blows up and kills Egghead, which sort of frees Hank from the Masters of Evil. And as they go through, because he's kind of built this reputation of being an evil person, but as the Egghead's lab is now open for the government to check it out, they find a bunch of evidence that shows that Egghead forced Hank to do all these things. So eventually, all of his charges get cleared, and he's offered to rejoin the Avengers, but he refuses at first because he wants to work on himself, but, due to popular demand, etc., when the West Coast Avengers come back around, that's when we see Hank Pym kind of rejoin the groups of the Avengers and try to be a hero once again, which is actually quite a long time. But all that aside, even if he wasn't, so once again, I was not justifying his hitting of his wife. I want to throw out, even if he wasn't originally supposed to mean to do that to Janet, he goes on to do bad things anyway. So all that to say, Hank Pym's an awful dude. And yes, he has a mental illness, but that doesn't excuse how you act. He has the ability to listen to people and try to treat it, but he also has a lot of hubris, so he refuses to do anything about it. So, in the event that you are struggling with mental health issues or, your mental wellness, please seek out professional help. That would have done a world of difference for Hank Pym, and it can help you too. Power level! Marvel Strike Force doesn't care about power level, but here on Frosty Features, we do it on the way that this works. If you are a multiversal threat, that means you are a threat to all of reality, not just your reality. You could topple the multiverse at a whim. Universal means that you can end your reality, perhaps hop on over to another one and end that, taking them out one by one style. Cosmic means you are a threat at the small side on a planetary scale, and with enough time and effort, you could take out things like solar systems or small galaxies. Nuclear means you have power equivalent to that of a nuclear bomb, being able to level things like small cities on the small end, all the way up to a planetary body on the large end. Super Soldier means that you are beyond all human capabilities of strength, taking out things like brick walls or even a city block. City means that you are a human being level individual, but trained to the absolute and utter peak of human ability. Think Olympic athlete. This is where we find a lot of our ninjas, our mercenaries, are secret agents and things in the Marvel lore. And then there's Greg. Greg is the undead Asgardian that is spawned by Hela in Marvel Strike Force, and when left to his own devices, with no Hela to back him up or anyone else, Greg isn't worth a thing. So, theoretically, I, as a person who's avidly shopping at JCPenney's, am going through the dense racks of all the nerdy menswear they have there, and Greg bumps into me and tries to grab the Captain America shirt that I want. Turns out Greg is a big Captain America fan. This is now in canon. And so as we struggle over the shirt, a physical altercation occurs, and in this situation, because I am a regular human being, and Greg is a regular human being, but I just happen to have had my breakfast that day, and Greg did not because he's an undead Asgardian, I theoretically could take Greg in this fight over this t-shirt, and yes. So, for all sakes and purposes, Greg is equal to that of an average human being, undead Asgardian, just for the sake of argument, because I think it's hilarious. So, in the case of Hank Pym, what do we have? We have a super genius that creates suits and chemicals and things that alters himself, what have you. He's a self-made mutate is what he is, right? But he can grow to great sizes, shrink to small sizes, transport himself to different dimensions in doing so. And also, he created things like the stingers that kind of give these multiple things a blast out. So, the way I rate Hank Pym is actually a nuclear threat. Because of his large scale of attack, his influence doesn't typically count, but in this situation, he creates robots on the frequent that have nuclear cosmic effects. So very much Hank Pym has the ability at whim to create, use large stinger blasts, or swing his arm and take out buildings and things like that. So very easily at super soldier level, but even to nuclear when we get so large, when we get so big, when we use certain blasts or technologies that he uses, you do have to think Hank Pym at the end of the day really is sort of a discount Tony Stark, who is very much in the nuclear cosmic sections of his own right, because it's freaking Iron Man, baby. And according to Scopely, honestly, other than the small discrepancy that may or may not exist with the Ultron that I can't prove because I couldn't find the Ultron thing, hit me up in the comments with it, I really want to see it. I thought this was a fantastic way to describe a character. And I don't understand why. This is enough detail. It's got a little bit of background. It's short. This is the length I feel like all of them should be. It's very descriptive. It tells you who he is, why he does what he does, etc. I think they did it. Honestly. Other than pointing out, I do feel like it's important to point out that Hank Pym's kind of a trash human being. But besides that, I really feel like this is detailed enough that I read it and I have an idea of who the character is. I have an understanding of what's going on. This is how the blog post should be. 9 out of 10 pending the Ultron situation. I couldn't find it myself. But that was Frosty Features Hank Pym. I hope that you all enjoyed it. Please let me know your favorite Ant-Man or the Wasp moments down in the comments. I would love to hear it. And please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this here on YouTube. It doesn't cost you anything but a couple of clicks. And as a reminder, every Sunday at 8 a.m. Central Standard Time, I stream on Twitch where we do Frosty Features live. I hope that you all enjoyed this. I hope that you all have a fantastic weekend. Most importantly, y'all, stay cool.